well, the only place that things last for a while is in nature. So what does that actually mean in practice? And I think it was through that lens that we really started hearing the question when we were talking about quality in business around, well, what's durable? Where did it come from? What leads to durable patterns? What leads to durability in nature? Hey guys, welcome to The Art of Quality with your co-host Paul Higgins. Today is a slightly different experimental episode. We have had many conversations with learners and listeners over the past year or so. And one of the questions that we have been asked multiple times is to be able to share some of the patterns that are emerging across our dialogues. Today, myself, Will Oliver, and John Candeto, my co-hosts, are going to explore the idea of what business owners can learn from studying nature and natural systems and apply into both investing in businesses and also building businesses that endure. Today, we'll reference a deck which has been prepared over 2 years or so. That deck is all about the patterns that we see in nature and in natural systems that we think are relevant to business builders. Please see the link in the show notes, and we hope you enjoy.
Gentlemen, it's very good to be here with you. In the spirit of teeing up this conversation, I would love to take us to the origins of our interest in this topic, quality and the patterns of nature. It started a few years ago. Paul and I started spending time on the phone, both as builders. So Paul, I think for our audience, we'll ask you to share a little bit about your background. I'm William Oliver. I am a co-founder of a business called In Practice. We study companies, we invest in companies. And I had been very interested as someone building a business in what lasts a long time in business. How do you create value over extended periods of time? Paul, you were interested, I think, in very similar questions. And as we got deeper into this topic, the question of how nature organizes itself kept coming up to the point where it became increasingly inescapable, I feel. So with that said, why are we talking about this?
And do we know what we're talking about?
Definitely not the latter, but
yeah, exactly. This one strikes deep. I guess I spent a decade in various different rooms, be it at an investor level within businesses or trying to set one up from scratch. And I guess hitting your head off a wall where you kept noticing that there are certain things that people who are building businesses know and just intuit. And then there's certain things that investors know. And both of them don't respect the fact that both have a really interesting map that there's lots to learn from. And there's a huge difference between how they perceive the long-term kind of value being built in businesses. And usually founders hate investors. Usually investors say they don't get us. And there's just like a distance created. And that kind of led me, certainly over about 10-year period, to be like, what leads to the ones that survive? Like, what leads to the businesses that actually endure over time? And I think the businesses that endure over time was what led Will, you and I, and then ultimately John and Fedi as well, to this question of, well, the only place that things last for a while is in nature. So what does that actually mean in practice? And I think it was through that lens that we really started hearing the question when we were talking about quality in business around, well, what's durable? Where did it come from? What leads to durable patterns? What leads to durability in nature? And I think that's really the smallest element of where this kind of very big concept came from, where we started saying, yeah, that's a fair question. let's actually try and understand at a ecological level or in the natural world what survives and how it survives.
Beautiful. I find this topic endlessly fascinating. I think people to the point where it's just a running joke that I can't finish a sentence without mentioning Fritjof Capra. I think John, who's also here today, I think I'm not mistaken that he's definitely taken the piss out of me a few times for that. John, you've also, you joined the conversation probably a year into Paul and I becoming increasingly obsessed with all this. What's this to you? Like, why do you care?
Well, my frame on most things is truth with a capital T is how the world really works. And wisdom is aligning your actions to truth. And so I think whether you're building a business or investing or really whatever you're up to, if you can move closer to truth, or as McGilchrist would say, if you can unconceal more truth, then you're going to have a little better map of how the world really works. And then you have an opportunity through wisdom to better align your actions to that map, to that truth. And so for me, I remember being in high school and learning what fractals were and thinking, one, man, these things are cool. Two, the math behind them is really interesting. But three, it's kind of like looking at tree rings or like looking at the leaves on branches or looking at root structures or watching flocks of birds fly and self-organize. And so, there was just this very sort of obvious, visual and then the math behind it language of us trying to articulate something that we're very clearly seeing in the world, in nature, when we go wander around outside. And that notion has stuck with me ever since that, as we try really hard to understand the system of a business or understand what's worth building and how to maximize the odds that we survive and what we invest in and all that kind of thing, there are these kind of deep structural patterns that we seem to be able to learn a lot from in nature. And so that's kind of what drew me in and what keeps me in.
One of the early questions that we explored in this was Michael Mubausen. His papers are fascinating. I think all of us admire his work. And what we kept noticing over time was like his papers were evolving to value being defined in a different way and in a different place. Like he was speaking to the value of networks. He was speaking to the value of relationships. He was speaking, and like over time, that became a language that was then being used in investor circles. Like we kept talking about various different investors we'd admire speaking to dynamic, almost like rivers as analogies or forests as analogies. And I guess there was like a subtle move for people starting to talk about a different type of map. They weren't talking about IRRs. They weren't talking about, financial, any sort of P&L based metrics or cash flow based metrics. They were speaking to what was moving in the system and the quality of the movement. And certainly for me, I struggle with that language. I was like, I don't even know where to start with like trying to figure out like what they're seeing and that map. And so, yeah, I'm sure we'll get into it, but like very much for me, it was a mini frustration internally with the language being used to be like, I don't quite get this, but I see that folks are measuring value over time in a very different way in some of these businesses that frankly they were holding on to for decades or even longer in some cases. And they spoke to a different quality within the system. Like, listen,
and you put that in. So like, I think an observation we've all shared in Mauboussin's work is he has moved over the decades from, in some sense, the more quantifiable to the less quantifiable. And he's done a very nice job quantifying things that maybe could be quantified a bit that weren't before, but also recognizing that not everything that counts can be counted. So, I saw that in the business I was part of building. We had numbers, namely margins, that would show up, and in the context of the history of businesses, you would say the math is either wrong or this is fraud. And the reality was we were just building a kind of business that wasn't possible to build 50 years ago. And so a friend of mine says, the whole world is overweight what can be quantified and underweight everything else. But I think you see that in the trend in Mauboussin's research. He's more and more realized that the things that are harder to count or can't be counted are mattering more and more, or maybe have always mattered more, and we're just waking up to this. And then you put that against the zeitgeist of the culture we're in, which I would still is largely in this view of if we can't count it, I'm skeptical, or I maybe won't count it as seriously as the things that I can count. And I think that's kind of a conviction we all have here, that we're not convinced that that's the right approach.
Yeah, and even just from personal experience, having gone to Berkshire over the years, I found the language there is a language anchored in this. So when Buffett or Munger are speaking to the evolution of a business, they're speaking to the evolution of a moat. The moat is a dynamic thing. They tend to use language that is very natural to dynamic things. So it might be the quality of the relationships in the businesses, the quality of the operators, but they often speak to like investing through that farm analogy of, effectively, if you're investing at a farm, you'll treat it very differently than a high frequency trader. Well, when you're using a farm analogy, that's a natural system. And that's nature in many ways. It's dynamic, it's volatile, it's crazy, but we all know like what goes into a farm. And of course you treat that differently. But I guess it's a bit of a jump, but that was one of the things that certainly sparked, well, maybe Fritjof and those who are much, frankly, smarter and much more experienced than any one of us in the natural world, maybe they have a lot to bring to this side of the kind of exploratory side of investing and also building businesses as well.
Let's get into this. What does nature, if we've sort of loosely defined over the last however many minutes how we think about quality in business, right? Assuming that we're solving for duration, we're solving for some degree of ecosystem flourishing. What does nature tell us? What principles have you come out of this, Paul? And I think you've come out of this, and we've all been thinking about it. Your thinking, I feel, is particularly clear on this, certainly more articulate than mine, in what nature tells us about quality, and in particular, I think for our audience, like how could we articulate this in a way where someone investing or building a business actually walks away with something here?
So to make sure we anchor this to the real world, I guess my answer is I started spending a lot more time in it as opposed to I guess I spent about 2 years deep into the systems world, started studying like different thinkers who bridge the world of physics and ecology. And it's a really weird crux, really weird mix. But those who have gone from something that's highly quantitative and in pursuit of clarity and almost, I'll use the word certainty, probably not right, but you get where I'm going. And then they matured away from that towards more qualitative elements. And Fritjof was one of the first thinkers and also like practitioners in a way that I saw bridging both of those two worlds and then speaking to the concepts of biological principles that endure are the following, and then social principles that endure are the following. And then he spoke to economical principles. And he just spoke in very basic senses of like how we evolved to where we are today, right? And I think when we looked at durability of a system, what we were all really annoyed about was like everybody basically defined it at a P&L or an abstract away from a balance sheet level. And you're like, what? Like, of course, I could define what the perfect mathematical theory is, but there's a reason why no mathematician is actually good at investing, right? Because the real world doesn't work in the same way, right? So we just kept going deeper and deeper in the layers. And I think like there were certain principles that kept coming up. One of them that really kept coming up in the investor world was, is there anything that ultimately is durable? And I use durable as a concept of like permanent, right? So like go to its extreme. And I think what we all realized pretty quickly, and also it's something that Fritjof talks about a lot, is like everything has its time and place. Everything that is living is on a rate towards entropy. And ultimately, there's nothing that has enough permanence in it with enough permanent resources that in the living world will be here forever. And it was just this amazing thing when we started thinking about how many investors we spoke to who were like, we want to hold this forever. It's going to be around forever. And we realized that like there's just this bit of a mind trick that seems to be kind of at an investor kind of finance level. But when you speak to operators and businesses, they're like, the longest I'll project out of business and have any degree of certainty is maybe 3 years, because that's basically as long as I have to tell whether my customers still trust me. And like, there was just this amazing difference between like the acceptance of it's like a death rate that was implicit within the business. Now, there's lots of theoretical language we can attach to that, but it's almost irrelevant. It's just like, there's a metabolic rate in systems. And as you're young, your metabolic rate and your ability to grow is hypersensitive to the conditions around you and how much resources you have around you. And sometimes the resources are people, sometimes it's money, there's a hyper growth phase, and then there's a maturity phase. And even that basic insight around like S curves obviously was a thing in the VC world. But actually, when you look at nature and the natural pattern around growth, S curves have been around forever. But the real question is, where are you on it? And where are you trying to actually project yourself to be in the next 10 years? Are you early in it and you have 100 different outcomes that are like death, or you're going to be the most valuable company in the world? Or are you at the tail end and you're See's Candy or Coca-Cola, and there's a pretty high degree of certainty that there's a fair amount of momentum behind you, that you're likely to be, you'll have some durability. And so we started like learning how ecologists thought about the growth rate through forests, and started seeing like there's a durability of those systems too, but they're also sensitive. So if one form of infection gets into one sequoia tree, it can wipe out all of them. Or there might be a fire that comes through that gets sparked off, just like in LA. Like, frankly, that's just the world as it is. But we had the wrong map. We were trying to say durability, and we tried to look at it through the math lens. And like Will, John, we've had so many conversations around it that like ultimately this concept was wild relative to where we came to the concept. When you actually looked at nature, you ended up like coming to a very different place. Does that did you guys take?
Yeah.
Was
Well,
this similar
I'll
for
connect
you?
it to an investor said to me a few years ago, in the long run, the price of an investment is just volatility that jumps around the adoption of whatever they're offering, whatever the company's selling. And I thought it was a very nice way to put that. And this connects a lot of places, right? Peter Lynch, one of the things he got famous for was drawing a chart. This was before all the cool data viz tools we have now. And he would just plot stock price and earnings growth. And if price was rising faster than earnings, that meant the thing might be getting overvalued. If prices, earnings are rising faster than stock price, it might be cheap. But, fundamentally, it goes back to, so you could think of infection in a forest to have the same properties and dynamics as adoption of a product. One of the things that I think you can't spend more than 5 minutes poking around nature before you start to realize that everything's in a network. Everything's in relation to each other. And what trees are in the forest, and what shrubs are in the forest, and what weeds are in the forest, and all of that, those are inputs or variables that matter when you're trying to answer a question of how quickly will this forest grow or die. And exact same thing in business or in relationships or in, that's just sort of how organisms exist. And so if you're trying to figure out what's going to flourish or shrink and how durable is a thing, you kind of have to understand or think about what's the network that those things are in and how do they relate and so forth.
Yeah. And just on networks almost have been in existence since day .1. Right? Even when we were a unicellular kind of cell going to a multicellular, that was the first network that was established. And now we are where we are, right? Millions of years later. But like we came to this, be like, why are we noticing that most balance sheets that we're seeing are basically being built out through network effects? What does that word even mean? And why are some people claiming it's the most important thing in business these days when you have technology? And I think there was this kind of overuse of the term, but in biological terms, networks and Fritjof this is one of the core principles that he operates from, is like a living network is something that is sustainable, but it's sustainable to the extent that there's like a dependency on everyone else there. So it's no different to a family. A family is a network of 5 people, in my family, for example. And ultimately, in that network, it's participatory. We all know that. It's the same as spouses. It's the same as family systems with kids and relations and everything. So we know them quite deeply, but like, it was laughable when the 3 of us started to even start to talk to the quality of our relationships in those spaces. I certainly came up at a loss to be like, I actually have some language for it, but I don't really have that much. And I don't really talk to it over an extended period of time, right? It's just it's such an implicit knowing that the qualities are emergent.
You live it, right?
Yeah, like, I mean,
we don't. You know, when life gets hard, you know, if you have a wonderful family, your family has your back. But you don't put that on a balance sheet, right?
Yeah. And Will, like, you know this.
It. Yeah.
Like, Will, it's so deep in a world where you've lived in multiple worlds, multiple countries, have networks around. And same with you, John. Like, it becomes more clear. The clarity you get that networks can be a butterfly effect in your life is like, it's not even up for debate, frankly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, a lot of it that's accessible through questions, right? So one, like a common one that some slice of folks like to do is, what happens to my family if I get hit by a bus, right? And there's a very financial answer to that, which is life insurance and wealth management, all that kind of thing. There's one of my friends like to say relationships are the greatest form of insurance. And that's sort of the thing that's actually been true, you know, since the dawn of our species. An ability for a family to persist for many generations is much more tied to the relationships they have and the relationships they foster than financial products or advice or whatever. And then you look out in nature and it's basically the same thing, right? You know, if you will ask a question like, why do certain species survive and others not? You can't answer that without having some idea of what relationships those species have to other things.
I think it's, as we've gotten into this, the clarity with which it's pointed us to a study of the quality of the relationships any organization or entity is embedded in. I mean, we've built a career out of this, but I think we've done so much more consciously in the last few years in terms of understanding value chains, ecosystems. And I just continue to be blown away by this simple question of, you know, if I want to understand how long something's going to last and how well it's going to do, I want to attend to the quality of the relationships that the entity is embedded in. And that's Peter Kaufman's, you know, multi-party stakeholder system right there. I think Kaufman, Paul, just as you said, Kaufman gets this, Munger got it beautifully, Buffett gets it. And then it's evolving. I think in the clarity that Capra brings to this topic, in bringing in nature as a stakeholder, I'm very interested to see how all this gets applied into business over the next few decades as we start thinking increasingly systemically. It's so deeply practical. Like for us, just day in, day out, what's the quality of the relationship you have with your customers? What's the quality of the relationship you have with your suppliers? What's the quality? And all that, that's in large part intangible. It's very hard to measure. It's the good, the true, and the beautiful type of domain. And it's devilishly hard to quantify, if ever possible.
But and it's not to say see it and you can feel it, right? I had the opportunity to meet the CEO of Bauer, which has like 50% market share in hockey equipment globally. And you can sort of see why from the stories that are told, right? This is hockey gear by people who don't live to make money. They live to play hockey. And they want others to play it too, and they want others to enjoy it. They want it to be the best stuff that, you know, and it's sort of, I mean, it's no different than when you find a passion to share with a friend. It's just that that passion happens to be in the wrapper of a business. And then when you pit that against, just think of the sort of the most repulsive business person you know, right? And you sort of like pit that against that. It's no surprising that one is much more likely to last a great deal longer than the other.
there's two simple examples. Like, so the win-win approach was quite interesting because through natural systems, you need to be really careful about the rate of growth in a business. I think so I came to it assuming like, how do I identify, exponential growth or really fast and then like identify the really interesting business opportunities, markets around me. Well, what you realize is on the basis of the growth is only possible to the extent that there's available resources in the system, you start to look at this really differently. You start to say, okay, you're Costco with one store. What do you need for durable growth to get to 1,000 stores, 2,000 stores? And then when somebody's projecting, they're giving you the financial model, they're giving you the spiel on commercially, this is how I'm going to do it. And by the way, I'm taking this big balance sheet from this one investor and they're going to support me to do it. You start to really pay attention because you're like, okay, so you're going to beat like natural systems. You're going to outtake basically every other business that's ever grown. And I think like it was just a map. By no means does it tell you like a huge amount. I guess it makes you sensitive to variables in different ways because you start to say, right, that rate of growth in Coca-Cola for 50 years, someone going in there today, assuming there's another 50-year arc in it, what are they actually underwriting? Like, should you look at a 15% as sustainable over time? And is any system, has it ever grown at 10% for 100 years? And you pretty much realize nothing has. Very few things have. So I found it very clarifying in many ways.
Two.
There you go.
And they're hilariously simple. It's tobacco and rocks.
Yeah.
Those are the two.
Rocks.
Those are the two that I know of that have their businesses that have grown in excess of 10% per year for 100 years. And but even there, right? So back to your point, so where do those top out? Well, once everybody who's going to smoke is smoking, right? And ultimately you're tied to, GDP and population growth or decline. And then for rocks, it's, once we're building everything we're going to build at whatever rate, then you converge with that basically. And that's it until we go multiplanetary. And then that, maybe you get another S curve in there.
Exactly. No, I think like the Santa Fe guys are amazing on this, right? And we have to recognize like there's a bunch of this that they've thought about for 30 years, right? So very much I kind of consider Michael Mubasing coming from that line of thought where they were integrating these two worlds, and we are now certainly benefiting from lots of hard work done there. But the language they speak to are feedbacks and feedback loops and constraints. So when you start to look at a P&L or balance sheet or cash flow statement through those two things, they're useless. So you actually start to say, I need a different map. And there needs to be something below this. And so to use your smoking example, there's a reinforcing feedback loop for behavior and human behavior. So when we become addicted to something, we keep going. But there's constraints. And the constraint is when the system is sick of it or you're making people ill, then they start to pay attention. And so like, just even from a natural system perspective, that was a piece of language that like really helped, I think, all of us get to a point that we could speak to these things much clearer, much easier.
You start to realize that the financial statements are measuring outcomes of systems at work, and the ability to distinguish one from the other actually has a lot more to do with you understanding the system. I mean, it's interesting that we could tell the history of the world's great entrepreneurs, and they are not all in technology or all in finance or there have been phenomenal entrepreneurs building cars. There have been phenomenal entrepreneurs building grocery stores, which historically are horrible business. There have been phenomenal entrepreneurs in technology, right? But it's interesting that these sort of, I call them power law people, but these sort of one-of-one people who build one-of-one things, they haven't all clustered in one place. And then when you start to double click on what makes Costco, as we've studied on this pod and things like that, you start to realize that actually it has a lot more to do with the system and how it's being managed and the feedback loops and so on than it does with the fact that we're in retail or we're in tech or whatever.
The other two distinctions that I took in a big way around networks was everybody spoke to value chains. Like, let's take Boeing example, right? How could you tell how Boeing was trending over decades? And was it in good direction or bad? their network and their value chain was so complex. They basically had 100 customers on one side and them in the middle, and then on the supplier basis, thousands of components going in. And it was actually, Will, through many of our conversations around you guys and how you think in practice around that dynamic of like, how do you perceive at an ecosystem level whether these things can endure over time, and like, are they growing well or not? And that inherently is like, frankly, a static point in time data point is useless to you. You need like some way to speak to that over multiple years and how it's trending, not one specific point in time. I'm intrigued, Will, like how you guys even came to this way to speak to that in a, like, even using the framing of like what's available for public companies or what's available for private companies. How did you even start to think about measuring the dynamic kind of element of this?
It's been a question of, I think, an increasing confidence over a decade that the action is, I think, let me put it this way. We've been very skeptical about any ability we might have to understand anything by just looking at numbers. We love numbers, and they're magic, and they're awesome, and you need to pay attention to what can be measured, and it often does reveal a lot. And then you have, like, how does something actually work? And then the insight, I feel that to understand how something works, the action is in the relationships. Quality is in the quality of the relationships. And so for us, whether it's Aero or anything else, it's just been this process of, our entire careers of chipping away at speaking to every conceivable stakeholders and speaking to every variety within each category of stakeholders, speaking to as many people as we can or could, and inviting them, creating a container where they might feel comfortable to talk about what they think is true about quality in relationships and who has power and why they make decisions. And I feel like it's, some people, who is it that I heard talk about, the Jane Goodall approach to information gathering. You just, sit in a bush and watch. And that's done everything for us over the years, to the extent that we made any sensible decisions in where we invest our own capital, how we operate our own business, how we've structured our business in a way that gives us time to make decisions, that gives us time from everything from hiring to the way we price part of our business. And there's a media business component within the IP1 holding company, and we have our balance sheet capital. But I think it speaks so deeply to what you've been talking about, in the sense that it's, my feeling for a long time has been that much of the world has things upside down, and for good reasons, right? And upside down, by that I mean an extreme focus on what can be measured and an extreme aversion to trying to look at stuff that's harder to quantify, that in our estimation is actually like the most important thing. If you want to be involved in anything for any period of time, and we sit in the intersection of we're trying to find great businesses to invest in over decades, and we're trying to build an institution that supports that process and supports people that share this ambition. Yeah, John, I see you taking a breath in.
Well, there's one way to look at this is how our species has reacted to our growing ability to quantify things. And I think of this as a pendulum that swings between maximum hubris and maximum humility. And so what I mean by that is, basically take human history up until Newton, right? Much of what happened in the physical world pre-Newton we assumed was magic or from the gods. Even very simple things like the rolling of simple dice. We now understand a 6-sided die that's fair has a 1 in 6 chance of landing on each side. And the math is so laughably simple. But pre-Newton, when we didn't really understand how physical objects move and the laws of motion, depending on who you were talking to, it was either magic or the gods or whatever. So that was sort of our, call it, pre-quantification world. And then Newton comes along and says, hey, there's laws of motion and gravity, and here they are. And our pendulum swung from sort of we don't know to now we can know everything. and so we worked on that for, a few centuries and did really well with it too, by the way. It led to some amazing things through the Enlightenment and the Renaissance. But then we got to electromagnetism and we were stuck. We said, oh my goodness, there's more here and we don't understand it. So then we move off of, maximum hubris, maybe back towards humility. But then Maxwell comes along and describes the quantification of all of what's going on in the electromagnetic spectrum. and so then we go back to maximum hubris, and then we get stuck on, what we eventually learned to be relativity, and we didn't understand it. And then Einstein comes along. And so my point is this pendulum is going back and forth. And I think just the zeitgeist we're in right now is, partly marked by us being a bit puffed up as a species that we can quantify all this stuff. We can do all this cool statistical stuff. And now we've got, unlimited compute and on and on and on. And so it goes back to that. We become overweight what can be quantified and underweight everything else. And yet, if we zoom out a little bit on all that, and certainly Will, what you talked to, a lesson that you and certainly the rest of us have learned is, I think it's clear if you sit down and think a little bit, that there's much more we have to learn than that we've learned already. And if you think about that, then I think the wise position is actually more humility than hubris. And if you think about that, then you kind of sort of invert our epistemology from, look at how great we are and look at how much we've learned. And you go back to, actually, if we've got more to learn than we've learned, how do we do it? And then you go back to, well, what's been a great well of wisdom and learning so far? And then you get back to places like nature, where it seems like every time we study it, that the whole history leading up to what's now the Santa Fe Institute, more or less was, folks struggling and fighting with nature and realizing it always had more and more and more secrets. And still today, I think that's still the path they're on. And so then I think the wise man says we need to study it more.
Yeah. And I think the studying it more, I think, was certainly from my experience after 2 years being in that world, and also still am to a certain extent. What I always found funny is the ecologists knew it intuitively because they're dealing with nature every single day. They're right there. The tree is dependent on them. They realized how dependent, and that feedback loop and the dependency was the feedback loop that taught them. Because we will always learn through the systems that are dependent on us, be it child, be it a family, be it cousins. And I think that was the thing that made it, I found there was a huge distortion between those who knew in the ground, in the territory, those who were in their 70s who love gardening, or grandparents who love spending time with young kids. It's there's a very close feedback loop that they were paying attention to what was going on, and they were learning all day long. And then you had this group up above who often were investors who basically never had to deal with the tree a foot away from it. And they never really had to water it every single day. They never had to watch it evolve or think about what would happen. And I think that it was a really interesting moment where I was like, this is funny because the quote from Bateson and from a lot of these folks in the natural world is basically where all this goes wrong is the human mind's perception of the event. The event is always it. The event was always what it was, but our abstraction away was where it all kind of went wrong. And Bateson famously is saying, ultimately, when people realize that pretty much everything around you is living, you'll start to treat things differently. There was a book called The Living Company that was written in the 1980s. I genuinely think it's the best book I've ever read on business. And it's so ironic because all this guy did was say, let's treat the company as if it's a living thing. How would you do it differently? And the other thing I'd just add on networks, right? Which kind of, to me, I went down quite a deep rabbit hole around power laws. And John, you're the expert in that side, right? On the network side, one of the things that blew me away was networks are one thing in this life. You use the word surprise, I'm surprised by this relationship. Or I met Will. This is a perfect example. First time I ever spoke to Will, it was like, have you ever met this Irish guy? And I was like, how is there someone who's nerding out on all these things? And it was through you that I got connected. So there's a non-linearity in networks that doesn't exist in the map that we all use in investing. And there's a non-linearity in networks and relationships that we see through the PayPal mafia, or through that book, The Power Law by is it Malaby, or the whole basically history
Sebastian
of
Malaby,
VC,
yeah.
and they all come from one small ecosystem, and it has endured. Why? And like, it's fascinating how what we all now hear in the media when they're speaking to that dynamic, it's all, look how amazing these 5 people or the small group was. But ultimately, just at a pattern level in complexity science, that is, networks are nonlinear. Pay attention. And so humans typically, for things that are nonlinear and compounding, we get surprised by it at some point. It might take, it's a delayed feedback loop, right? So we might take 10 years, might take 15, but by the time you're surprised by it, most of the good stuff has probably happened. And so at a network level, I just think there was an absence of language to this dynamic that I found in investor conversations. It was just generally like when people were talking about it in a business sense, it was like, well, what's non-linear in this system? Let's forget about financials.
I'll tell you,
like, let's just
straitjacket. A straitjacket that I think many people don't realize they're in is the type of database that is behind Excel and Google Sheets and most business systems is called a relational database. And it's exactly what you think it is. It's rows and columns, and how do they connect? But there are a whole bunch of logical assumptions in that. The big one being that's the proper way to handle the data that we're dealing with, that it becomes a straitjacket in a way. So one of the things that was novel, for example, about Facebook is Facebook is a graph database. And the theory for graph databases has been around for decades. We just didn't have the tech to implement it. But the very practical thing here is, what was cool about Facebook is suddenly we could realize, oh, John and Will and Paul all know each other. And you could do that in a relational database too. But you could also realize that we all know that same Irish guy, to your point, Paul, or that we all like Led Zeppelin, or things like that, which actually, to do that at scale, the math of that gets very large and very complex very quickly. You just need a different paradigm to deal with it. And then, of course, unsurprisingly, where do we get the theory for graph databases? Nature. And so that's another, that's a straitjacket I would say many analysts are still in, where they don't even realize they're in that paradigm. And now we're just starting to have the tech to deal with that. And I'm 100% convinced in a decade from now or whatever, we're going to realize the graph database wasn't complex enough and we've got to evolve to the next one.
Yeah. Well, it's part of, I think, this experience that many of us are having of these straitjackets just becoming visible. Another one is the machine metaphor. It's the industrial revolutions. In wonderful ways. It's an awesome metaphor, but it was fetishized to the extent that it's blinded us to so much of the action. This idea that the world is a machine that is very useful in certain contexts, but utterly useless in others and deeply misleading.
Yes, there's so much wisdom in that. There's one where, if we want to poke fun at the value chain folks, there's always a temptation towards things that make you feel like you've understood something, or that's another way of saying we hate uncertainty more than we dislike certainty that maybe isn't quite accurate. But where that goes is to your point on the machine wheel, right? So it's sort of like, input, process, output. And it's just very nice to think, somebody explains a company is, Costco does A, then B, and then they get C, and now I get it. And if you just
and it's like, why didn't you get it? They've been talking about this since day one, but you only got involved in the last couple of years, right? And so
this is why you just can't understand a thing without. Amazes me how many investors invest in something and they've never used the product, and that's rampant, right? They're probably more in that camp than not. But I don't know how you would understand Costco without being a customer of Costco. I just don't. And all you need to do is talk to one Costco person, most of whom are kind of fanatical about it, to sort of get that there's something here. They don't talk about Walmart the way they talk about Costco. And the only way to unpick that, no amount of spreadsheets are going to unpick that. It's just, you have to go try it, right? It's also a great deal more fun to deal with the world that way too, right? You get to try lots of interesting things.
Yeah. And in many ways, that kind of leads us into this is one of the second principles that basically kept jumping out at us was the word maintenance is really important in certain worlds. And in an ecosystem, and Fritjof Capra uses the word like the world is inherently regenerative. Well, that applies from everything from a cut in your finger all the way to some point, if you could actually take out an oak tree, something else will grow. Forest, even after a big burn, everything fully comes, well, may not be in its exact same form, but it does regenerate over time. So natural systems tend to be regenerative. So at a social layer, when we talk about businesses, or even at an economical layer, what we found was those that actually focus on that as a pattern, that maintain the quality of their relationships, that maintain their operations well, that maintain their customer relationships well, they tend to endure much more through challenging times. So to use a natural systems example, imagine I spent much time on a farm, right? There were many a fire, just call it a kind of a random event. A big fire would come through. It would wipe out 10, 15 acres. And the next spring would be the most flourishing, kind of, frankly, like admirable event and the highest yield that they'll ever have. And so there was this like natural event that happened. Well, when it came to business, people didn't really tend to pay attention to like regenerative patterns, apart from people who thought about culture. I kept coming across it in that world. But like when you came to operations, finance, frankly, pretty much even sales now, I find sales is worse with this. They used to care about this, but I find there's an absence of maintaining of customer relationships in basically every tech-enabled business I engage with. This pattern kept coming up, and Stuart Brand is writing a book on this because he thinks like it's kind of been almost 50 years of a question he's been working on. And I definitely encourage people to check it out as Work in Progress. Like Work in Progress is the name of the actual website. I just put in Stuart Brand. But the idea of the system or a business that is just focused on maintaining of the different layers in its business. So customer relationships, it's stakeholder comms, it's building and maintaining the trust with the customer, it's maintaining the quality of your supply chain, your operations. There was this pattern that just, I personally found all of the best business builders I've ever studied, met, got to know over time, they all had this. This was them. They lived it, they breathed it. And the same with a 70-year-old who was taking care of his garden. He just focused on maintenance. Because once you structure it well, then it's just about keeping it at that layer. So it was one of these kind of aha moments that I think all of us, when we got to this point, we're like, wow, now when you come to architecture, you think about maintenance of buildings. And we honestly, we were all looking at each other and be like, wow, that's also an issue there. Like we don't see older buildings being maintained. And frankly, at a certain point, if they're under-maintained, they have to be destroyed to be restarted. Like they just, like if you can see an old building that is maintained well, the value of that relative to one that hasn't been maintained well, I think people think it's like a linear, if I underspend by €100, I lose €100 worth of value. It's actually a very non-linear compounding effect. And it's the same in human relationships, from my experience, same in social relationships, the same in friendships. Some people don't have those 5 people at their end of their life, right? So I think that pattern really jumped out. And like even when we started looking at some of the M&A kind of consolidators, there's an element where some of them had this model of like being able to effectively rejuvenate themselves and rebuild a whole new business line and evolve over time from one paradigm to the next, whether that's TransDigm or Constellation or, different types of businesses, not even to put labels on them, but like some of them really had to lean into this pattern and say, if we don't accept that this is how reality works, we're destined to not be here. And so that was just one of the other big ones as well. I don't know, John, whether you're whether anything sparks off on that, but I certainly find it like every single day I easily am spotting that like 4 or 5 times at different businesses and like just focusing on it completely differently now.
Yeah. I mean, if you're going at this from what lasts a long time and why, I mean, in a delightful way, not that any of this is easy, but in a delightful way, some of it is very straightforward, right? When you go have a great interaction with another human, that's delightful. That can be a coffee with a friend, that can be meeting someone new, that can be being served by someone in another business. And in all cases, when you have a delightful interaction, you'd like to have another one, right? And so it's unsurprising, let's say in a business context, if you figure out how to build a culture where on average the customer interactions are delightful, the odds of survival go up. And that I mean, that's not a secret to anyone, right? That's just being human and paying attention, right? And choosing to reject
the beauty of the system to
very
that,
much.
which
It's
is
rejecting what you love. You term the machine metaphor, right? It's, I mean, stop with these oversimplifications. Just be human. Understand you're human. Think about what it is to be human. Think about what works. And then if you're thinking about a business, think about, does the business harness that stuff or not?
Be systematic about who the business interacts with and map every stakeholder relationship. Put yourself in the shoes of each relevant stakeholder. Think about what a win looks for them and make their life better. And the more inclusive you are, or the more win-win relationships you're embedded in, my sense is that the longer what you're doing will continue because energy wants to flow through that riverbed. That is the simplicity on the other side of complexity. And then you have the, build that. And are you the person to build it? And, am I looking at a business where there is a genuine interest on the part of the leadership in solving stakeholder problems, in thinking about things in an integrated way, in the art of compromise when stakeholders have diverging interests? Can the quality and the culture handle that? Can the quality and the culture handle reconciliation of polarity? Again, a lot of that is the numbers are great, but the numbers, I think what we're all looking for is how to spot systems early in their life cycle that are likely to do well. And that's where you don't have the numbers to rely on in the early days, but you have people and you have how they behave and you have people's track records and you can run references on people and you can observe them as they interact. And we're back to, like, how do you build systems to attend to intangibles, to attend to quality in relationships, to all the way to actually understanding? I think we get a huge amount of mileage in trying to understand what actually motivates. I mean, I think about this in really practically in our business. What motivates my co-founder and I? And we notice that certain types of motivations energize more people than others. And the greater the extent to which we actually align our desires with the flourishing of people we're involved with, the more people want to hang out.
Yeah, which is that's mentor-mentee relationship. That's leadership 101. It's this fascinating, I think, attention that you pay to something when you see it as a living system worthy of that, right? It's that's the subtlety that I find. Sorry, I point the finger at myself, right? For 10 years, I basically used language that mechanized what this system was. And then you actually realize very quickly that I was fortunate that I had a couple of mentors who basically didn't know the world, didn't speak that language. I'm like, what are you talking about? This is the only thing that is. This is what my experience over 50 years tells me. So how are you triangulating those two things? And what you've just described, Will, is I think the path that when you're in the middle of the building, you have to embrace that. Otherwise, your thing won't exist. Whereas when somebody else is looking at it from above, it's a really hard pattern to see, right? They don't even have information to see it. They probably won't ever meet the Will in this scenario. They probably won't meet one of your employees to even ask a question like this. So there's the public company sphere is very different, but actually even I'm finding the private company that even before they get to the public company sphere, that's even almost more difficult because you used to get lots of access to actually understand these things, but basically that doesn't really happen anymore in an institutional sense because everybody's competing for the same asset. So nobody gets to speak to the companies, the customers, and those relationships. Really, some get to speak in some ways, but they don't get the whole picture involved. That is a hard-earned kind of nugget of wisdom, right? That you kind of only learn through usually walking into the wall or getting punched in the face in Ireland, which is usually the path.
And taking time. Nobody has time, but if you have time to sit and watch, and if the quality in your capacity to attend and pay attention is high, that you've refined your capacity or worked on your capacity to pay attention, you've thought about, I think something I guess we all talk about is the quality in attention is to what extent am I able to move beyond my attractions and aversions and my desires to see what's really going on? And then can I give myself time? And to the point today, can I learn from what clearly has lasted a long time in the natural world to point me in the right direction?
Yeah, on that last bit, at the level of our species, there are a lot of ways in which we're going faster than we ever have, and we've been speeding up. And one of the things I've done in the last couple of years that I've learned a lot more from than I thought I would is just have a few plants in the house that I have to care for. And it's a very different time scale, right? If the thing is sick, it doesn't get fixed in 10 minutes. You don't water it every 20 seconds. And the point is that the connection between input and results is it's going to go at the pace it's going to go. And you have to be subservient to that or you kill it. And so for all the compression of time that our species is doing, this is actually something I think is really, really interesting in the crypto digital asset world, is we are spinning up companies and shutting them down and having fraud and abuse and waste and all that far faster than we ever have. But of course, the stories are the same as they've ever been. When people build something that's useful, it can do well. When some people build something that's based on nothing, it collapses. It just collapses a lot faster now. When people are fraudsters, they get found out eventually, and now it's just faster. But the story, the song is always the same. It's just going a little faster. But then I think the wisdom in that is actually it's the principles we started this conversation with, right? It's if you're going to build something, what's worth doing is worth doing well. And whatever the domain and so on, it requires being in a good network. It requires good feedback loops. It requires sensitive to the starting conditions. It's, et cetera. And so in a sense, it's very comforting, right? Because while it feels like we ought to move faster, actually the stuff that is likely to last a long time is the same stuff that has always been likely to last a long time. And then our allocation of time ought to be more towards that direction than, in some sense, keeping pace with the speed of things.
Gardening as a metaphor I find very helpful in that context of moving from a machine metaphor to tending a garden.
And D. Hock did that, right? Like the irony is he over his 10 years building out one of the most valuable businesses in the world, he then flipped to being a gardener for the rest of life and said no to most commercial queries to him, because he was like, this thing, I've now shifted away from the art of having spent 10 years building what's potentially one of the most valuable ecosystems ever built, and then he flips into effectively just the natural world. And it's this pattern we kept seeing with a lot of like really, really capable, not only investors, but like business builders that are like, they tend to go to the natural world afterwards, whether that's architecture, and they start to really focus on like nudging the natural world with a home and like what that could look like. But it's not for show. It's actually very much to work with it, or they just look to mold the natural world with water, or there's different ways. But D. Hock, I think his book Chaotic Organizations, and just anything around D. Hock is worth studying with this, because he is this whatever we're trying to describe, he has the essence, I think, that is definitely helpful to understand, can even be weaved into this ecosystem. And a couple of nuggets that I kept coming up on the natural side is, one, waste basically isn't a word in nature. Don't bother using it. Everything is effectively a byproduct that usually is food for something else. So when you kind of accept that as reality in the natural world, then whether that's kind of forests or whether it's in the water, there's always something that will benefit from a carcass of a whale going to the bottom and all the sea creatures actually feeding it. And then there's regeneration through the system. And I think that pattern from nature actually is really valuable in a business context too, because there's byproducts for what whale does. And John, and we've seen this in tons of businesses over time, that like there's byproducts is the language used in a business sense, but actually there's waste that often is more valuable than the actual unit itself. And whether that's a dairy co-op that suddenly found that they can sell whey protein at an infinite amount more margin and value per unit. It just exists everywhere, and waste management it's one of the kind of economically one of the most attractive businesses typically across markets as well.
I think the equivalent of that in the world of bits in the information age, where we have billions of knowledge workers, is action produces information. And you see this in business building and in investing, right? So it is very common for businesses that ultimately became successful to try something and it didn't work, and then try something else and it didn't work, and then try something else and it didn't work. And so one telling of the history of that business might be, they failed a bunch and then eventually they succeeded. A different telling of that history is they needed to take action and produce lots of information to figure out what was worth doing. And I think that's much, much, much closer to the truth. I mean, of course, there is just waste of capital and waste of time and so on. So I'm not suggesting that. But if you sort of trace the precursors to Paul, the businesses you're involved in, and Will, the business you're involved in, so it's very hard to segment or to say with certainty what was actual waste versus what was learning. And it is absolutely true that much of what we learned led to where we are now. And so in that sense, you sort of start to treat the waste as precious rather than waste.
It's so ironic. Like Bell Labs in the 60s, most of it led to network theory that led to the internet 40 years later. Like everybody thought of it as waste for decades. And then it ended up maybe being the incubator of all incubators, and did it the same with Steve Jobs and his calligraphy course. Like these small things were actually required through the journey to be able to actually integrate the whole. And that's where I find it really interesting in a business sense, that like, where did we lose this truth? Because certainly in food manufacturing, I grew up hearing the stories of the factory owner go around and pick up any of the meat that would have been discarded in the boning hall, pick it up and say, would you throw away my $20? And like, he valued it because he knew very intuitively that the person who was actually discarding the waste didn't value it. That's fine. But actually in the marketplace, we heard this even in the Costco example. Actually, the waste around the trim in a salmon might be the most valuable element because it goes into omega-3. And the process that Costco go through a product to choose waste as a source of value is just a perception difference, that they look at it through that lens versus, frankly, most other people. So that degree of care, I think, for your process, it leads you to care a little bit more about byproducts in like a positive direction, if that makes sense, rather than actually something to kind of just be discarded. And I see it a lot in people-based businesses with people, that a lot of leadership will look at people as a byproduct, and ultimately they see hiring and firing at times of chaos as just something you have to do. And whether that's, we won't even use names of people, but we all know who comes to mind. But like, ultimately, they're the better businesses that we all study. That's not the pattern they choose to go with.
Yeah.
They choose to
and even
double
cultures,
down.
Right? Like I thought it was wild. It was reported, but I think wildly under discussed in COVID, when, the world hit a point where it was economy is going to come to a halt. And most of the world that was trying to move quickly, at least, said, we've got to cut resource, and they start firing. A common reaction amongst organizations in Japan was, hey, we all need to take a pay cut so we all get through this together. And it's completely unsurprising. Just think if you were an employee there, right? It's completely unsurprising, all things equal, where your loyalties are going to lie, right? And then it's further unsurprising, all things equal, where the better work is going to be done, right? That's mercenary versus relationship. And so anyway, I think there's a lot the world can learn from that.
Yeah, and just to round out on one point, because I know we're coming up to time, but one of the other principles that kept coming up was this idea of systems being inherently creative. One of the reasons why this one really came to the forefront with us is like with AWS through Amazon, it took like 15 years people see the value there. There was basically, it took Nick Sleep to be able to talk about a scaled economy shared. And then the investor universe suddenly started paying attention to this. Well, when you start to look in a business and say, well, what's below there and where's the creativity and what kind of velocity will that come with? Like, what pace will it come with? I think you start to see the pattern that maybe wasn't seen in some of these businesses that we all know, and that maybe hindsight bias tells you were really valuable. Now, there's survivorship. There's lots of reasons why they're hard to predict and all that kind of stuff. But I think like there is an inherent pattern of like those that are willing to enable their employees to be creative and their employees at a business unit level to reinvest, to be creative. And they give space like Bell Labs to tinker. I think that there's something to be said for looking out for that. It encourages like a diversity to the system that embraces the fact that they kind of know that certain things are always dying. It's just what rate they're dying as a business unit in the system. And that the ones that are really big now will actually fund the next one that needs to be big in 10 years. And that creativity through a system is a pattern that like we struggled to talk about in a finance lens, but actually when you started to kind of strip it out of that in a commercial lens, it made all the sense in the world.
It's so powerful, and it's a tricky topic, but I feel like the insight for me in what you're sharing right now around this topic of creativity is, you know, we often in a contemporary context think creative, well, especially organizations that aren't particularly creative think you have to force it. It's quite common in our culture to think of, you know, there's a dearth of creativity. And I think what Capra offers and what nature offers is just it hits you hard that the system of nature is inherently creative. And therefore, what might it mean to remove obstacles in business to allow that inherent creativity to come through? And I think there, I tend to get more and more interested over time in systems, organizations, businesses that are thoughtful about the conditions that their stakeholders exist in and are very conscious about removing the obstacles to an underlying and inherent creativity that then has all sorts of knock-on effects in terms of resilience, in terms of, you know, growth. It's quite a difficult topic to explore in that it's very difficult to look at through what you can measure.
Yeah, and then I think it takes a lot of time. There's a reason why it took Munger to turn up to Buffett to get from quantitative stuff to qualitative stuff. I think there's like experience required and someone to tell you and point it out. And I think we're in the middle of that, right? We're all trying to just experience our way towards some ounce of wisdom, right? But it feels like some of the pieces of the puzzle started to make a little bit of sense after we started talking about that. But equally, there's also a lot of people who start to take the systems and nature map and then like force it down the throat of business. And I don't think we're doing that either, right? It's like, actually, no, we just found that was a better way to speak to what we were seeing. And that's, I think, to be candid, like how certainly our group, how we actually think about it. And ultimately, it feels intuitively the right way to do that. And you start to get to like different language and you start to get to treating businesses in a slightly different way that actually might lead to much better outcomes over decades than you otherwise would have.
Just in terms of quality of life, quality of relationships, just how much fun things have become
or a better
over
marriage
the last few years.
over the next 3 years.
Right. Well, and it's so as we wrap this conversation, I think that we've touched on, you know, if we look at what nature tells us about how life is organized in networks. Life is inherently regenerative. Life is inherently creative. I think a topic for another day is intelligence itself in the system of life. But these things, I think to the extent that we care about this at all, and what we're, I think, very excited. I feel like safe to say I speak for all of us in that we're deeply excited to continue exploring these threads through conversations in the podcast with practitioners who have lived these dynamics, who have direct experience applying these principles. Whether or not they've thought about the principles and then applied them, I think more often we'll find ourselves speaking to people who have learned this irrespective of theory, who actually have never encountered the theory around this and have just tried to build things well. and have noticed pretty quickly that relationships are incredibly important, that understanding how one fits within the system is incredibly important. So,
yeah. And to know, like, if ultimately you are a pharma company giving out the wrong kind of tablet, eventually someone gets you in the system. And if it's non-win-win, then over time that might go to zero. And so there's, I think you're bang on. And I think I definitely would recommend anyone who's interested in this stuff. Fritjof Capra is awesome. Gregory Bateson, Nora Bateson. The book Living Company is fabulous. And I'm sure I'm leaving out 100 other people. D-Hawk is fabulous.
D-Hawk comes up as someone that applied this beautifully in business. I think you have, whether it's businesses like Hermes or Brunello Cucinelli, there's quite a few businesses out there that get this. And so, yeah, this has been fun, guys. I hope our listeners have enjoyed it as much as we have.
Yeah,
Paul, thank you.
It's one of the nerdier ones.
Yeah, thank you for dragging us down this rabbit hole. Dragging's a strong word. I gladly fell down it, but thank you.
We'll also link. We will link
the deck, yes.
The famous deck.
Put that on the site. Yeah.
Any complaints, direct them to Will.
It's all my fault.
All right, guys. Have a great day.
Thanks,
everyone.
Pleasure. Appreciate it.
Onwards.
Cheers.
See ya. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening. For more resources, please visit our website, theartofquality.co. If you want to connect or have any feedback, please feel free to reach out.